As good a reason as any to pick a college. So I submitted the US applications, but mentally I was all set to go to college in India. It turns out Lady Destiny had other plans. In March 2002, DePauw wrote back to me, not only accepting me as a student, but offering me a very generous financial aid package. For the life of me, I couldn't quite figure out why this tiny college in Indiana was going to pay me, an unknown student, to attend it. But the offer was too generous to refuse. So in August that year, I found myself standing on the lawn in front of Bishop Roberts with 2 suitcases and a mind full of excitement and apprehension. My first 2 years at DePauw were incredible. I opted to study computer science, a subject I had enjoyed thoroughly in school, and I loved the coursework here at DePauw. Full credit to Scott and Dave and the team. I also kept myself busy in a variety of capacities on campus, at the newspaper next door, as an admissions ambassador, Men Against Rape. I rushed Phi Delta, and Greek life was a rather novel experience. And thanks to ITAP, I also did a few internships. So I was fully ensconced in the DePauw bubble. Year 3 was memorable because my brother joined me here at DePauw, and my girlfriend came to the College of Worcester in Ohio. It's about 350 miles from here. So I convinced my father to buy me a car so I could shuttle back and forth. It was a 1987 Acura Legend with a moon roof. It was my pride and joy for the next few years. And all along, I'd done a reasonably decent job of maintaining my grades. But what became evident was that my performance varied depending on the subject. While I had a perfect GPA in my major, I scored lower in many of the other subjects. I thoroughly relished the liberal arts approach, but there were definitely some subjects I enjoyed more than others. For example, I had no trouble spending hours writing code in the basement lab of Julian. I'd even spent a few winter nights there when the walk back to Phi Delta had seemed particularly arduous. But I struggled with writing papers for arts classes, for example. So, second semester junior year, when the panic of eventually having to exit DePauw just descends on you, I had the idea of going to graduate school for computer science. I was told that the summer between junior and senior year was the best way to secure the foundation for a post-DePauw opportunity. So, in the quest for a research gig, I carpet-bombed a long list of professors at large universities. Most never responded. But it just so happened that one from Boston happened to get back to me with potential interest. That March, during spring break, when everyone else flew south, a few friends and I took a road trip to Boston to meet with this gentleman. It worked out. In May, I was sitting in the Maxwell Dworkin building at Harvard, doing a game theory project as part of an AI research team. The summer project quickly extended into the fall semester, and it was an incredible learning experience. Not just from an academic perspective, but also because I realized I didn't really have a future in academia. I didn't have the research temperament. I just couldn't spend 12 to 14 hours a day focused on a single problem or topic. And I missed the hustle and bustle of my DePauw life when the average day involved a half dozen meetings squeezed in between classes. So I came back to campus knowing that graduate school was off the table. Unfortunately, I didn't know what was actually on the table. And worse, I had contracted a particularly virulent strain of senioritis. Somehow, over the course of the past 7 semesters, I had managed to string together a math minor. But because I'd been away in the fall, the final requirement demanded that I take a differential equations course in the spring. The first few weeks were smooth sailing. Since my brother was also taking the class, there were no problems. He eventually graduated with an econ and math double major and a cumulative GPA that was almost 4.0. So he was a very dependable shoulder to lean on when it came to homework. The trouble started with the individual project work. That was a few weeks in. And I realized that my boat was toppling over. So I marched to the registrar's office and demanded that my course be changed to pass-fail. The request was denied. It was well past the deadline and there was no hope. So I begged, I pleaded, I might even have shed a tear or two. And the lady there finally relented. Ironically, it was because she was impressed by the rest of my transcript, and I convinced her that if I actually took the course for a grade, my record would be irrevocably tarnished. So for all you current students, if there's one lesson to take away from this talk, it's that do not take a difficult class your last semester at DePauw, especially if it's differential equations. So by the time spring break was upon us, the search for my post-DePauw career was actively underway. But the confusion with what I really wanted to do still persisted. I was considering a variety of roles. One that involved a credit analyst role at a financial services firm in New York, and another that was the management development program at Enterprise Car Rental Company. Both seemed interesting, neither compelling. I was on the verge of opting for one when Lady Destiny intervened again. And this time she came calling by way of the Lilly Center. By my own admission, I was a regular at the Lilly Center. Its proximity to Julian, the epicenter of my DePauw experience, also helped. Loane and Carol Engelstad had set up shop in Greencastle to build a software as a services platform for technicians in the aviation industry. They both had tremendous domain expertise, but they were looking for somebody to help them with the technology aspect. That's where I came in. I was introduced to them through Dr. Dennis Trinkle at that time at the ITAB program. Loane recognized me as the brown chap who frequented the gym and tried to lift heavy weights. I recognized him as the very fit older gentleman who did bicep curls with a weight I could barely bench press. We connected, I had a job. It was also my first taste of entrepreneurship, and it was brilliant. The Engelstads entrusted me with recruiting and managing a development team. For someone like me, just out of college, that was a fantastic experience. I interviewed and hired developers, many of whom were twice my age. We worked out of a few rooms in the basement of what used to be the National City Bank building. It went very well for a year. But as luck would have it, we suddenly hit a wall. The gentleman funding the venture was diagnosed with cancer, and he had to pull out. Consequently, we also had to wrap up. The story of how I got my next job, my second job, is as atypical as the first. One spring morning, soon after this, I barged into President Bottom's office. For those who don't know of him, he was President Casey's predecessor. I demanded his help with rapidly locating gainful employment. He and I knew each other through a variety of campus engagements, and he also knew of me as the Indian who'd stayed on in Greencastle after graduation. There weren't that many of us. I gave him a quick rundown of the situation and mentioned that if I didn't find another job immediately, I'd have to leave the US because my visa status would expire. I also mentioned to him that Cummins was hiring and asked if he might be able to connect me with someone there. I knew Cummins was a large Indiana-based employer with a DePauw grad at the helm, so I felt I might have a shot. At the time, I was also a bit shaken by the carpet suddenly being yanked from under my feet, so I was leaning towards doing something a bit more stable. Now, President Bottoms was, as I like to say, a little bit like the Godfather. He never made any direct promises in his office. As with many previous incidents involving me barging into his office and making a demand or two, though the previous ones had been mostly campus-centric, all I got from him was, "I'll see what I can do." Within 10 minutes of my leaving his office, I received a call on my mobile phone. "Hello, this is Tim." "Tim?" "Tim Salso from Cummins." I almost dropped the phone. The CEO of Cummins, a multi-billion-dollar company, had just called me. Tim asked me to go meet him in Indianapolis. Naturally, I complied the next day, and within a week, I had a job at Cummins. Now, for most people, a job at Cummins is a multi-year chapter in their lives. For many, it is their lives. For me, this was not to be. Lady Destiny had other plans. Within a year of starting there, I missed out on the work visa lottery. Some of you might be well acquainted with it. Every year, a pool of visas is allocated to foreigners desiring to work in the US, and the process of distributing them is usually via lottery. Cummins very kindly offered me an expat posting back home in India, but I wasn't yet ready to go back home. Also, confronted with the work visa situation, I was forced to do some soul searching. And that reinforced my growing concern that a corporate job wasn't really for me. I had tried professional stability, and it was not my thing. I was also in the first stages of what I like to call mental unemployability. More on that later. But also, after 6 years, I was keen to broaden my horizons outside the US. So I took the GMAT and applied to business school. For a variety of reasons, Oxford was the only one I really considered, and I just got in. I had arrived at DePauw, a callow 17-year-old, 8,000 miles from home. I arrived in Oxford as one of the youngest in my class, barely 23, still callow, but considerably less so thanks to DePauw, and this time only 5,000 miles from home. Oxford was and is remarkable for a variety of reasons: the students, the university, the experience. But what was also remarkable in my case, as well as that of my fellow classmates, is how inopportune a moment we had picked to do the MBA. Within a few weeks of the start of the program, Bear Stearns went belly up, and the financial crisis officially placed its stranglehold on the global economy. Companies stopped recruiting overnight. We were fortunate to have the Oxford halo above our heads, but even then recruiters didn't respond to emails or phone calls. Many of my classmates, a number of whom had moved to Oxford with family, with husbands, wives, kids, considered going back to the jobs they'd had prior to the program just to make ends meet. But even that was oftentimes not possible. The Said Business School at Oxford has a reputation for being entrepreneurial, but in my year, those numbers went up exponentially. From the ashes of the crisis arose many a startup, as I like to say. I, for my part, joined a small team in London that was doing some interesting things in the realm of mobile payments. But within a few months, I was approached by a German company that was pioneering a new advertising model. I moved to Berlin as an early employee there, and that was the start of a transformational chapter in my life. SponsorPay, the Berlin-based company I joined that later rebranded to Fiber, was a tiny company with ambitions way too big for its boots. And yet, over the course of the next 4 years, we managed to attain many of the lofty goals that we'd set ourselves. How? Well, a number of external factors worked in our favor. The mobile apps market blossomed. Some of our competitors took a wrong turn. And we were fortunate to have well-wishers who helped us out. But those apart, there were also a number of internal factors: an insatiable hunger to succeed, and a stubborn refusal to take no for an answer. We managed to secure investment, we established offices in 7 cities across 3 continents, and we grew the team to a headcount of almost 150 over the course of the 4 years that I was there. Along the way, we won multiple awards, including one for the second fastest growing digital company in Europe. Of course, it wasn't easy. But one thing any startup founder will tell you is this: on their list of top priorities, talent is second to none. And we did well on that front. We found a core team who felt as strongly about the company's success as did its founders. I wasn't one of the founders, so technically it wasn't my baby, but I treated it as my own. So did the others. No job was too small. And initiative was key. Whatever we wanted to see done, we did ourselves. We all made tons of mistakes, but we were careful to learn from them and to try to not repeat them. My boss, Yanis, one of the founders, who was and is just 4 days older than me, was as much of a sparring partner as a supervisor. It was an experience like none other, especially the first couple of years. But in my 4th year, I decided to step away. It wasn't an easy decision. Emotionally, I was still very invested in the company. But at the same time, the company had reached a certain level of maturity, a stage at which I felt comfortable stepping away and handing my responsibilities over to someone else. From a financial perspective, my shares were fully vested. And also, I had been infected rather aggressively by the startup bug. I remember having a conversation with my father when he retired, and I asked him why he didn't just find another job. He told me that he'd arrived at the state of mental unemployability. He didn't want to work for anyone anymore. What happened to my father by the time he turned 60 happened to me at age 30. I wanted to leave fiber so that I could do it all again on my own, as a founder on my own terms. I wanted my own baby. A few months after I left fiber, the company was sold for $190 million. That helped endow me with some financial flexibility, but it also made me even more keen to set up shop on my own. So how did Zeotap, my current company, happen? As has so often been the case, it happened by way of destiny and relationships. Last summer, as I mulled over my own entrepreneurial ambitions, Jan Beckers, one of the co-founders of Fiber, connected me with Daniel, who's one of my co-founders today. Daniel was, at the time, looking for someone to help him build what he pictured in his head as the ultimate data platform. At age 32, after spending many years at Vodafone, he realized that telecom operators were sitting on a wealth of data that, if utilized correctly, could be uniquely effective across a plethora of business verticals, everything from advertising to financial services to transportation. Daniel had already found Stefan, my other co-founder, a career salesperson who at age 33, after having grown a business at IBM from $20 to $200 million, decided he wanted to do it all over again himself, but this time on his own terms. So Daniel was looking for what I like to call the third prong of the trident, a product person. And that's where I came in. Interestingly, I too had been exploring the idea of a data platform, so our ambitions were congruent. Daniel had actually tried a startup many years earlier while a college student, but it had failed. The team had not seen eye to eye. So this time around, while he was convinced of my abilities, his biggest concern was the chemistry between the three co-founders. My biggest worry, on the other hand, was whether two ostensibly corporate chaps, one a Vodafoner and the other an IBMer, would be able to adapt to the startup model of working. One that might best be described as scrappy and agile. Some of you might recognize those as euphemisms for cheap and chaotic. It turns out our concerns were unfounded. The three of us often joke that over the past year we've spent more time with each other than with our wives. We've learned a lot from each other and continue to do so. It's not that we always agree, but while our disagreements involve smaller topics, we're always on the same page when it comes to the larger, more important decisions. Ironically, that's also what I told my wife before we got married. And it's been a 12-month roller coaster. We've signed agreements with telecom operators across Europe and Asia. We're in the process of doing so in the US as well, with the setup of an office in New York City next month. I've recruited a product and engineering team in Bangalore, where we are building our global technology center. We've raised about $8 million in funding and are in the final stages of another large round of investment. All of this has not been easy. Fundraising took almost 6 months, and while we maintained a stiff upper lip throughout, there came in the middle a few tense weeks when we were on the verge of an overdraft on our bank account. Even as an early employee, finances are important, but as a founder, your employees are your responsibility. And finding the right talent continues to be a challenge, especially because finding people with the right skill set is only half the battle, the easier half. What's even more important is to find those with the right temperament. It took many months to find our VP engineering to lead the technical team, and even after we found him, it took another 3 months to find the first employee, the first engineer on his team. All this 12 months in, and we still feel that we're only at the beginning of our journey. Running a startup often feels like running a marathon, but in sprints. So, if you'll indulge me, I'll leave you with a few learnings of mine. 3 on life and 3 on entrepreneurship. Life learning number 1. According to Louis Pasteur, fortune favors the prepared mind. As I mentioned at the outset of my talk, I'm not keen on the concept of destiny. And yet, having seen time and time again that things just seem to happen, things that are beyond my control, I've arrived at the conclusion that destiny can be molded by performance, but only partially. When I met Lowain to discuss my first job in Greencastle, it helped that I had a decent academic record. He was assured of my technical abilities. Of course, our flirtations at the Lilly Center also helped. But next, I couldn't foresee that my stint in Greencastle would be so rudely cut short. When I met Tim at Cummins, it helped that my CV was one that I could confidently put across, and it was one that he could confidently put forward to his team. When a year later, my stint at Cummins was rudely cut short again, it was the very same CV that helped me get into Oxford. I couldn't have foreseen that a financial crisis would cast such a long shadow over my time at Oxford, but once again, my CV was a stimulus for attracting interest from Fiber. Last year, when it came to making a recommendation to Daniel, I came to Jan's mind and he put forward my name with complete impunity because he'd been witness to my dedication at Fiber. How one can be prepared over time changes with experience. That one can be prepared doesn't. Life learning number 2. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, author of Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness, 2 excellent books, lists the 3 most harmful addictions as heroin, carbohydrates, and a monthly salary. I think we can all agree on heroin. Carbs, well, that's a discussion for another day probably. But the third item on that list, the monthly salary, that's important. One of the reasons I've been able to maintain a certain maneuverability in my career is because of a sense of financial freedom. I can't take all the credit for it. In a country teeming with poverty, I was fortunate to be born into privilege. DePauw's generosity also ensured that I didn't graduate with debt. But ever since then, I've tried to be judicious. Having seen the luxuries of financial sovereignty, my recommendation to you is be careful with your finances. As Warren Buffett so aptly puts it, if you buy things you do not need, soon you will have to sell things you do. Life learning number 3. In startup law, there exists an axiom that the first round of funding for a company comes from 3 sorts of people: family, friends, and fools. Dropping the third category, even in the context of startups, family and friends are a lifeline. They are those that remain by your side no matter what you do and where you are in life. They provide the shoulder to step on when you need a boost, and they provide the shoulder to cry on when you're down. They're also the happiest for you when you do well. Whatever little I've achieved to date would not have been possible without my family and friends. Moving on to entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship learning number 1. Talent is the foundation on which any company is built. And this is especially true when you consider that the overwhelming majority of startups fail in the first 12 to 18 months. So for fledgling startups, they demand a certain type: those with an appetite for risk, and the initiative to assume responsibility for things, and the ability to get them done. Peter Thiel, co-founder of PayPal and the first investor in Facebook, writes in his latest book, 0 to 1, "Brilliant thinking is rare, but courage is in even shorter supply than genius." And that's why startup founders are so focused on recruiting. Attracting the right team is pivotal to a company's success. And from a founder's perspective, as Jared Kins has remarked, I love teamwork. I love the idea of everyone rallying together to help me win. Learning number 2. According to Tim O'Reilly, the founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media, money is like gasoline during a road trip. You don't want to run out of gas on your trip, but you're not doing a tour of gas stations. Ever so often these days, too much emphasis is placed on how much funding a startup has received. Of course, money is important, but what's more important is building a sustainable business on the back of solid fundamentals. Unicorn is a relatively new term in startup lingo. It's used to describe a company valued at $1 billion based on the funding it has received. But barely has the concept of a unicorn been established that people have started discussing dead unicorns. Companies previously worth $1 billion who are on the decline. Valuations are nice, but basic performance indicators like customer growth, customer retention, cost of acquisition, gross revenues, profits, those are critical. They're different from business to business, but those are what drive long-term value. Learning number 3. Many a rosy picture has been painted about startups and entrepreneurship. But as Ben Horowitz, former entrepreneur and co-founder of the legendary venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, will tell you, as a startup CEO, I slept like a baby. I woke up every 2 hours and cried. His description might sound a bit extreme, but it's not entirely off the mark. As a founder, your company becomes your life. And your life is like the finals week that never ends. Your company is the first thing you think of when you wake up in the morning, and it's the last thing on your mind when your head hits the pillow. Often, it's what keeps your head from the pillow. My wife has been unimaginably supportive, but even she will tell you that often she feels like an afterthought. It's relentless, it's exhausting, but it's also exhilarating and incredibly rewarding. To end, a quote that's been attributed to a few different people. If you don't build your dream, someone will hire you to build theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Projjol. At this point, we'll have a Q&A session. Projjol will join me here. I'm not Charlie Rose, but I'll do my best. So I think we have Joel in the back with a microphone for questions here in the house. And we'll also look to our friends online. But thank you so much, Projjol, for writing that on the plane from Berlin. That's a heck of a thoughtful
I wish I could have done it
reflection.
earlier.
No, it's wonderful. Mental unemployability. Never heard that term before.
I'm not sure I should have mentioned that in a room full of students, but it happens.
I wonder if you could take us back as folks are thinking of questions there. Tell us about how you chose DePauw. You could have gone probably anywhere in the world. You chose DePauw and the liberal arts. Why did you make that choice, and how did it prepare you?
So to be very honest, I didn't really know much about the liberal arts before I came to DePauw. I think Nipun, who was in my class with me, also from Kolkata, would agree. It was an interesting concept, but it was just that, a concept on paper before we came. But what became evident over the course of the next 4 years that we were at DePauw was that it really gave you a really well-rounded perspective on life. And I think that's been said and said again. But it's really true, for me especially, that today when I'm in the workplace, at a client meeting, talking to somebody, I can maintain conversation about a variety of topics. And that's something that on many occasions has been unique. And I don't think that's necessarily unique to me. It's unique of a liberal arts education.
Great. Invite folks. Any questions in the house here? Vince, yeah.
Thanks for speaking tonight. Really enjoyed that.
Sure.
I would ask for any entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs in the room, what book would you recommend, or books, and also any life experiences you've had that you'd recommend to them?
Sure. So some of the books I quoted, 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, the two Nassim Nicholas Taleb books, Ben Horowitz's book is The Hard Thing About Hard Things, is all great. The book I think that has no real connection to startups but is really worth reading for everyone is one called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. It's by a gentleman called Robert Fulghum. I read it many years ago, then I reread it recently, and it just contains some of the fundamentals of life, how to conduct yourself and how to treat people. I think that's important. Sure.
We'll go to one of our online viewers who starts off, Projjol, firstly, nice vest.
Thank you.
Okay. What are your views on the employment visa reform being proposed by Facebook and other companies? Have visa and citizenship issues proved to be impediments in your journey?
So my perspective is certainly a biased one, and they have certainly been impediments to me and to most international students I know of here in the US. And this is entirely a personal perspective. What has been the US's greatest strength over the course of many years that has helped establish it as the leader in innovation and industry has been its ability to absorb talent from everywhere. And that has changed over the course of the last decade, and it's to the detriment of certainly the US and industry. Interestingly, one of India's largest e-commerce companies was founded by a chap who was at Wharton, couldn't get a work visa, went back and is now leading what is a billion-dollar company today. And it's employed many tens of thousands of people. And that could have been in the US. And it's just one anecdotal example of the kinds of opportunities that the US is missing. So I'm, of course, all for the reform. At the same time, I do have another horse in the race. I like the idea of some of those coming to the US for education, going back to their home countries and building enterprise there rather than doing it in the US. It helps transfer some of the knowledge and it helps boost some of the economies around the world. So I suppose I'm in two minds about it. But from the US perspective, certainly it's very necessary.
Okay. All right. A couple more questions here. Yeah.
I mean, you've all obviously mentioned how important networking was to your job opportunities and how you expanded your own horizons. And I was wondering, do you have any pointers for how you established these connections? I mean, sure, some were extremely serendipitous, like at the gym when you see another person lifting.
Sure.
But how do you approach and how do you strike up a conversation that is memorable?
So I think what's important about networking is not to be mercenary about it. If you go in with the idea of getting something back, that's usually the wrong way to approach the problem. That said, the one thing that any startup founder will tell you is that everyone needs to sell. Whether you're working on tech, whether you're working in finance, whether you're working in any domain really, being able to sell yourself to investors and other stakeholders, being able to sell your company also to investors and to customers is a primary function for any startup founder. And those are skills that are best learned in the field. So one of my great experiences in sales, one that I detested, was a telesales role I did for a few months right after the MBA, just as a bridge. It was terrible. I hated every minute of it. I had to pick up the phone and make casual conversation with people who really didn't want to talk to me. Today, being at the other end of some of these phone calls, I know how annoying it is. But it taught me some basic skills of how to approach a conversation from zero, to how to build a relationship from zero. And those were useful over the course of the last few years.
Okay. Do we have another question down front? Yeah.
So you ended your speech by talking about a dream and how you should try and create your own dream and make sure that it comes true in a sense. So this is a two-part question. First part is, what is your dream? And you also recently spoke about how India and people coming from India or any part of the world as such should go back and innovate in their home countries and the importance of home countries. For you personally, what role does that hold, and what do you think is going to happen with that in the future?
I'll take the second part of your question first. When we formed Zeotap literally 12 months and 2 weeks ago, I wasn't really planning on having much of a footprint in India. It just wasn't on the radar. It was a Berlin-based company. We were looking at working with European telecom operators and US telecom operators. It just so happened that one holiday back in India, I spoke to a couple of people at one of India's larger operators, and the ball got rolling fairly quickly, and before we knew it, we had our first deal in India rather than anywhere else. But that said, where we did take a strategic decision to be in India in this case was when we chose to fix a destination for our global technology center where we would have our development team. The options were Berlin, of course we were incorporated there. The Valley is an option. It's not an option, it's a major consideration actually for anyone looking to build a business in tech. We chose to build it in Bangalore because it's where we felt we would have the maximum impact. Also, there's a certain momentum in the global economy that's shifting eastward, and that played into our decision as well. So over the last 3 months, I've been spending a lot of time in Bangalore with the tech team and in Bombay and Delhi with clients. And it's been a remarkable experience. It's the first time I'm actually doing business in India. And anyone who's done it will tell you it's interesting. But it's also been tremendously rewarding, so I'm very happy. As for my dream, I think that's a bit complicated, because it's not like I woke up one morning and decided I want to build a data platform for telecom operators. That doesn't happen. No one dreams about telecom operators. If anybody has anything to say about a telecom operator, it's usually negative because you hate your price plan or your connectivity or something. What was important to me was, when I started speaking with Daniel, was the application of data for decision making in industry. Subscriber data is exceptionally valuable as an asset. Of course, you need to be very careful with privacy and security and such, because it's probably amongst the most sensitive data sets you can find. But its application across so many different use cases made me realize that there's a tremendous future for the company and for the business. Advertising is probably the easiest, it's the lowest hanging fruit, it's where we think we can generate incremental revenue and prove the value of a potential platform to the operator, but that's not where we want to be in the long run. Telecom data is interesting from everything such as credit risk modeling. So in a lot of developing countries, there's not a lot of financial transaction data, so non-financial data, often social data, behavioral data is used as a proxy for financial creditworthiness, and that's where telecom data can have a tremendous impact. Transportation companies and a lot of economies can use the data around the movement of people to plan their itineraries, whether it's trains or flights and such. Retailers can use the data for store planning, store footprint planning and inventory management and such. And I could go on. We can use data for, we were just discussing that over dinner, for for fraud, for example, credit fraud. So if your card is being used in a location that's very far away from, if the card is physically being used in a location that's very far away from where your mobile device is, that's an indicator for fraud. That's a use case that's been initially established, but that you can grow on that. So what really enthused me about the idea is the massive potential, and that's what drives me.
By the way, Meher Makta, class of 2010, wanted to claim the vest compliment. It wasn't intended anonymously.
Thank you.
So, okay. You were talking about data, and you opened with the liberal arts. I wonder if you could address kind of the ethical implications of your business. You're taking a lot of data and making that actionable and accessible. What's the ethical side of that?
So that's a very good question. Being a company with German origins and roots, that's the first problem effectively that we addressed even prior to building the platform out, because privacy is of extreme importance in Germany. They're probably the strictest regulation on the planet when it comes to data privacy, and telecom data privacy is at a level even higher than regular data privacy, so we're dealing with some serious regulation here. And we worked very closely with the German regulators to build a platform that was compliant, not just compliant, but actually respected user privacy. It took many months, a lot of back and forth, a lot of brainstorming, a lot of innovation to actually get there. But I think today we are at a stage where we are confident that the system, the platform, is entirely privacy compliant.
Okay. Is there another question in the back there? Yeah.
Hi. So what are some of the biggest challenges you faced so far, or your startup has faced so far, and how have you dealt with them?
So I think the biggest challenge for us in the recent past was closing the initial round of funding. Actually, when I say initial, I mean the Series A round that we closed a few months ago. As I mentioned, we arrived at a stage in the middle where we were worried whether we'd be able to pay salaries to some of the team. And that can, lead to many a sleepless night. But what was interesting is that at every step along the way, even when we were 2 weeks away from bankruptcy, we believed that we could sign the deal and that we'd get the funding. And at no point did we ever have a discussion around the contingency options around what we would need to do. And some would say that's foolhardy, and it probably is in some ways. But it was also important that we believed in our ability to secure the funding, and I think a lot of that positivity played out when it came to the actual deal.
Hi. I wanted to know like where the money was going, like what
You
the
hear that?
product is, and what you are doing with the money you earn.
So as I said, talent is our primary consideration right now. We work in an industry with telecom operators which is a little different from the regular startup, if you will, because we can't hire very young, cheap, aggressive talent and expect them to deliver. Telecoms is an industry that's very traditional. It requires people with a fair deal of experience and expertise. So automatically our talent expenses are higher than the average startup. So that's a big one. We are investing very heavily in technology and product, so a large part of the funding is being put into the development of the data platform that's happening in Bangalore. And the last piece of it is a very international perspective to our growth. So we're focused on a few countries in Europe, we're in India, we're in North America, in the US and Canada. We are on the verge of moving into Southeast Asia as well. It's a structured approach, but it's a fairly diverse approach. For one, in our case, because any process with a telecom operator tends to take anything between 6 and 12 months. So we need to start as soon as possible so as to see the benefits of this process sometime around next year.
Dr. Burke.
Thanks for a great talk.
Sure.
A lot of fun to hear everything you've been doing. So I'm wondering if you could just comment briefly on a time when you've experienced a failure and how you've gotten through it, or if you don't want to talk about a failure, just a decision that you wish you had made differently. So you've talked a lot about serendipity and things working out well, but has there been a time either at DePauw or after DePauw where you wish you had taken a different course or something just did not work out?
So professionally, I can tell you a story of when we were the time at Zeotap has been too short yet to see any massive failures or successes for that matter. But back at Fiber, we invested very heavily in a business that we were very naive about. It involved selling to agencies and advertisers in New York and London. We were riding a success wave at that point. We felt that we could just go out there and do it. So we jumped in head first without necessarily weighing the pros and cons and the impact it would have on our business. It was one that required a fair deal of investment. It was one that we reaped some benefits from, but never really managed to grow into a successful vertical, primarily because we underestimated the importance of existing relationships in the context of advertising specifically and agency sales. It's an industry that's built, if there's any industry that's built around relationships, it's the advertising industry in New York and parts of Western Europe. And we just completely ignored it. We underestimated it. And so 12, 14 months after we entered the business quite aggressively, we were forced to pull out. We had to let go of a few people. It was an unfortunate process, and it taught us all many an important lesson.
Projjol, you've obviously found your passion as an entrepreneur, but you spoke of some of the joys and pains of entrepreneurship. Would you recommend to some of the students here tonight that they take the plunge right after graduation as entrepreneurs, or should they maybe get some experience first? What's your advice there?
So I think it's a very personal decision. There are some people who are born with an entrepreneurial spirit and it's the only thing they really want to do. I was not one of those people. I cruised through the 4 years at DePauw not knowing what I wanted to do. It took me a long time to realize that this was what I enjoyed and this is what got me out of bed and kept me out of bed on many, many an occasion. So I think my one learning from the past few years is that you have to find something you really enjoy doing. That could be now, that could be 10 years from now. It depends again on your own personal inclinations. But until you find that, it's hard to keep yourself motivated in the context of a startup.
Okay. Other questions in the house here? No? So take us inside Zeotap a little bit, under the hood. You mentioned when we were corresponding ahead of the talk, probabilistic modeling, predictive data. What is that? Tell us how that works. How do you use that at Zeotap?
So data is a commodity these days, and big data is probably the most overused term in business. What we are hoping to do, and we're very early stage at this point, what we're hoping to do is move from big to smart, and that involves a few different stages. And the data is just a collection of bits and bytes. A layer on top of that is information, and a layer even further up is knowledge. And the transition from data to knowledge can, depending on the industry and the business, can take many months. It can even take a few years. And that's what we are hoping to get to. I think it's we're also dealing with a data set that hasn't been utilized for the kinds of use cases we're talking about today. So there isn't an existing paradigm in the market. The only use case I know of a data set that's been utilized in this, of a similar data set that's been utilized in this form, is Facebook, who have utilized their data set for advertising and have built an 11, 12, $14 billion business from it. In our case, we are much younger, so we need to figure out the nitty-gritties of the data. We are starting with advertising, but while we think that's a lucrative vertical, I don't know if that will be the most important vertical for us, say, even 18 months from now.
Where might you go 18 months from now? Can you tell us? Or
so I think
trade
financial
secret?
services is one that we're
Okay.
seriously considering. It's if there's any domain that's even more heavily regulated than telecoms, it's probably financial services, so we just pick the best apparently, but it's a domain where we think this data can really make a difference, using non-financial data for financial purposes. And I think that would be probably the first vertical we'd consider. We already have a lot of inbound interest from financial services firms who have approached us for the data. We just haven't worked out the privacy and the ramifications yet. So until we do that, we probably wouldn't go down that vertical, and I can't foresee us doing that before probably 2017. So it's still a long ways off.
Okay. You've got such a great story with the Engelstadts here in Greencastle and bridging the campus community gap. Do you see more potential for students today to add value to the degree that you did in a small venture like that?
I certainly hope so.
Yeah.
Thanks to ITAP, we were exposed to a number of different businesses across Greencastle and the greater Greencastle area. There was a small ITAP consulting team my senior year, and what we went and did is help a lot of the smaller family-owned businesses with things such as a digital footprint that involved everything from the social media footprint to the websites. It was fairly basic stuff at the time, but it was stuff that they didn't have the resources for in-house. It was something that we could provide, and it was an exceptional learning experience for us. And I think instances such as that can both be very beneficial for the students as well as for the town-school, town-ground relations.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Liza Frame in the back.
Thank you, Projjol. I wanted to ask if you might have a few sort of pearls of wisdom for specifically international students in the audience. What are some of the things that you did while you were a student at DePauw that made the most impact on you in terms of being successful academically, socially, and professionally? What are some things you think now, knowing what you know, that were the most important for you, or some kind of advice?
So the academic one is interesting. What some people, some of my fellow international students did when they first came to DePauw is try and test out of courses, and it was relatively easy for some of us to do because we'd had fairly advanced levels of math and such back home even, and some of us even tested out of college writing, for example. And I chose not to. Back then it was because I just didn't want to take the hard classes first. It was it was a pretty selfish reason. But it was interesting for me to actually go through some of the introductory levels of, say, calculus, for example, because it was taught in a very different manner from what we had been back home. And that helped shape my understanding of math differently, and in some ways better than it had previously. So I would recommend trying not to test out unless you really have to for some reason around specific requirements, because I think learning everything from scratch or relearning in some cases can be very beneficial. It was personally for me. On the social front, I think what a lot of us did was that we chose not to remain solely within the international circle when it came to our social footprint. I think Nipun in the audience is probably the best example of that, and half of our class will tell you that. But
we'll ask Nipun to expand on that in a minute. Yeah.
He'd be a much better tutor than I when it comes to the social footprint. But I think that was important for us because it helped us build relationships with the DePauw community, not just with the international student body.
A good question online here. Forgive me, squinting to read this. I'm fascinated to hear how important relationships are in the development of your career. And yet, my observation is that our current culture is heavily based on my iPhone, my texting, my material success. What tips do you have? This is a long question, forgive me. What tips do you have that might help DePauw students acquire the skills to develop relationships and to value them so that down the road they don't find themselves out there without that relationship preparation?
So I think we shouldn't discount the importance of electronic relationships, because in today's really networked age where I am as an entrepreneur working in 6, 7 different countries, a lot of my relationships are maintained electronically, and that's just by virtue of not being able to be there physically all the time. So I wouldn't necessarily look at a Facebook relationship or a WhatsApp relationship as a negative. In fact, a lot of my clients are on constant WhatsApp with me. It's just the way business is conducted, especially in India, it turns out, but elsewhere as well. So I think that's important to note. That said, I think DePauw prepares you excellently for being able to maintain a conversation in person, look a person in the eye, and put your point across. I think the different distributed requirements across different kinds of courses are important. What helped in my case was putting myself outside of my comfort zone on occasion. I had done some public speaking. I had done a fair bit of public speaking in India, but it was certainly much more intimidating at DePauw as an international student to do it. My brother actually did very well. He was a member of the debating society here, and he went on to win many awards. So I actually got involved with the newspaper, and that was also very interesting. We had the newspaper tends to have a fairly independent outlook on things, and that got us into trouble on occasion as well. But it was also a learning experience for me, dealing with an independent editorial, something that I hadn't had exposure to in the past. So I think it's all a matter of taking advantage of the opportunities available.
Well, we're right on 9 o'clock, and with that, I just want to thank you, Projjol. We're so fortunate to call you one of our own at DePauw. You're going to be seeing more of Projjol. He's a new member of the McDermott Center Board of Advisors, so he'll be back on campus a week from tomorrow. Wonder how many people how many residents of Berlin will be making 2 trips to Greencastle within 2 weeks? That's pretty remarkable, and thanks for doing that and for all that you do for DePauw.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Yeah.